Chapter 46, The Reader, Hanyu's POV. Antony spent the next hour coddling Hanyu. He refused to discuss Hanyu's punishment, he refused to let Hanyu make suggestions about what it should be, and he refused to let Hanyu out of his arms. That part was nice, Hanyu had to admit. Under any other circumstances, he would have been elated. Though he was still too rattled for any great flights of joy, he didn't think he'd ever felt so protected in his life. Slowly, the clamor of his panic was dying down and allowing him to think again. Thinking wasn't as much of a relief as he'd hoped. Lord Marcus's words kept turning over and over in his mind. He killed his mother and every human he's ever taken to his bed. It seemed impossible. Antony had barely raised his voice to Hanyu. He'd hurt him only as a performance. He had extended mercy at every turn. He was cradling Hanyu against his chest like a treasure in this moment, after Hanyu had disobeyed him. How could he have... Was Lord Marcus making it up to scare Hanyu? That might not be the most respectful thought, but Lord Marcus wasn't his master and never would be, so he didn't feel too guilty about turning it around in his mind. Had the god lied? Somehow, Hanyu didn't think so. It would explain a lot about Antony's refusal to discuss his loves from before Marcus. It would also explain why Hanyu's swoon had frightened Antony so badly. And if it scared Antony, that meant it had been an accident, didn't it? It had been an accident, and Antony was sorry. That is, if it had even happened, which it probably hadn't. It hardly mattered. The question had been planted, and now Hanyu would have no peace until he got an answer. But he didn't dare ask Antony about it until he knew what his punishment was going to be. He didn't want to make things worse for himself than they already were. However, this peace couldn't last much longer. Hanyu squirmed in the tight embrace. Antony? He should have said my lord since he was in disgrace. I need to go to the washroom. The god's arms, which had been clamped over him like a vice, relaxed and pulled away. Hanyu missed the touch at once, but it felt good to sit up properly and straighten himself out. He stretched, luxuriating in the stretch of his muscles and the creaking of his bones. He didn't dare look at his master as he moved past him to the washroom. He wasn't exactly afraid. He knew Antony wasn't going to hurt him, but he felt shy of meeting the god's eye. He was afraid of seeing the same hurt on Antony's face that had been there after he'd snooped in the trunks. When he'd returned, Antony was sitting on the sofa, pulling on his boots. "Let's go see Theo," the god said. "I need to clear my head, and nothing will help with that more than one of your ridiculous flesh scepter books." Hanyu blinked a few times, then found his voice. "All right." He felt a little blindsided, but he had no real objection to the plan. Even if he had, this was hardly the time to be defiant. Bunta met them at the door. Hanyu might have been mistaken, but he could have sworn that the older man shot Lord Antony a poisonous look before making his bow. "My lord will be glad to see you," Bunta said. His voice was so even and untroubled that Hanyu decided he must have been mistaken. "Chihiro has had a good day. He'll appreciate the reading." When they entered Chihiro's room, Hanyu was surprised to find it already full to bursting. Chihiro was, of course, in his bed, looking as sunken and ill as he had before. Lord Theodora was curled in the big chair, Gyuri was glowering from a corner, and Kenta was standing beside Chihiro's bed and singing. "The false knight knelt before his queen, and lied through his oath in the garden green." His smooth, sweet baritone cut off as he noticed his new audience and flushed, making a deep bow from the waist. My lord," he stammered. "Forgive me, I didn't see—" "Never mind." Antony dropped down and sat cross-legged on the floor beside Lord Theodora's chair. "You're very talented. Hanyu and Theo said as much, of course, but you're better than I expected." "Isn't he wonderful? He cheats, though," Lord Theodora said. "He changes lyrics to give the characters happier endings. Chihiro told him off for that already once today. Didn't you old curmudgeon?" Chihiro made a vague sound that could have been either agreement or simple confusion. The yellowish cast of his skin was more pronounced today, and Hanyu was sure now that it didn't come from the torchlight. He'd never seen someone so old and frail before. It made him feel tender and a little spooked, but he could tell that it affected Antony far more. The god always looked everywhere in the room except at Chihiro, and when the old man spoke, his shoulders went tense and rigid. Hanyu supposed that age seemed very terrible to someone immortal, but still, something about Antony's discomfort made him nervous too. Kenta backed away, blushing. "You all honor me more than I deserve. I'm happy to cede the stage to Hanyu now. You were just starting a book, weren't you, Theo, my lord?" Kenta flushed at his slip and darted a nervous glance at Antony, but the god didn't react. Would you like that, Chihiro? Lord Theodora asked. We did leave that poor Duke right before the ball. All right. The old man's voice was barely more than a whisper now. Lord Theodora uncurled herself from the chair, then she and Kenta went to sit on opposite sides of Gyuri. The Surgish woman glared, but Hanyu thought he detected a slight softening at the corners of her hard, thin lips. Hanyu sat down and took the little book from the floor beside it. There was a scrap of fabric marking a page, so he flipped over to it. Chapter 3, he read. The Duke ran their hands over the rich embroidery of their gown and stared into the mirror. The sight that greeted them was no better than usual. Their eyes were a strange color, either sapphire blue or emerald green, depending on the light, and much too large and bright, just as their lips were too full and red. They were a freak. No one would ever want to dance with somebody who looked like this. Hanyu relaxed into the reading. He was surprised at how much he was coming to enjoy this. Back at the temple, he'd read for instructors and been graded on his prowess. Now he was learning how much fun it could be to read aloud for pleasure, to a small group of people he liked. There was a closeness and intimacy in it that caught him off guard sometimes. The Duke gazed down at the beautiful lady in their arms. She smiled back at them, and the Duke was lost in her determined brown eyes. They knew at once they would give their life for a single kiss from those sweet lips. Hanyu glanced up at that, already learning how everyone in his little audience would react. Antony rolled his eyes and groaned, but quietly enough that he wouldn't miss the next lines. Kenta was looking at Gyuri under his lashes, a faint flush on his cheeks. Lord Theodora, surprisingly less daring, only darted the quickest of looks at the Surgish woman. Gyuri, for her part, ignored them both and frowned straight ahead, her brow drawn tight in concentration. No doubt she was trying to follow the story based only on a handful of words here and there. Learning an entire language seemed like such a laborious task. And Chihiro, Hanyu's most important listener, despite the presence of two gods, stared past him, cloudy eyes fixed on the bit of curtain that served as a doorway. Was he simply staring at nothing as he envisioned the story, or was he waiting for someone to walk into the room? Hanyu was facilitating all of those moments. Something that could have been as individual as reading a book had been transformed. He was hit with a powerful wave of gratitude that, instead of reading by themselves, everyone had put their experiences of this book into his hands. It might have only been a silly story, but by hearing it together, it had become something sacred and communal. He'd never known that reading could be like this. Sentimental tears blurred his eyes, and he had to whisk them away to continue. After a while, though, his voice steadied and he went on for another chapter without pausing. The Duke stamped their foot in frustration. "You don't understand me, Mother. You never have. When I marry, it will be for love," they cried. Eventually, he darted another glance at Antony. The god did seem relaxed. Maybe this hadn't been such a strange idea after all. When he reached the end of that chapter, however, Antony looked over at Lord Theodora. "Theo, would you mind if I left Hanyu here for a little while longer?" he asked. "I need to ask Felix about something." "Of course." Lord Theodora directed her words towards Hanyu. "You're always welcome here. It's the least I can do after pressing you into forced labor on all your visits." "Thank you, my lord," Hanyu managed around the panicky lump that had sprung up in his throat. Antony seemed to catch the off note in his voice. The god smiled at him and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze as he passed. "I'll be back soon, pet," Antony promised, and then he was through the curtains and gone. Hanyu swallowed hard. Lord Marcus might have been right about his intelligence, but even he knew that when Antony found Lord Felix, they were going to talk about him and what he'd done. He supposed he should just be grateful that his master was consulting with Lord Felix and not a more fearsome god. By all accounts, Lord Felix was very kind and universally beloved. Still, more information was always better. "What kind of punishments does Lord Felix give?" As soon as the words were out, he squeezed his eyes shut, chastising himself. Just because Antony allowed his impertinence, it didn't mean Lord Theodora would be as forgiving. Kenta must be so shocked at his behavior. "So sorry, my lord, I didn't—" "Sorry," Lord Theodora said at the same time, her voice tangling with his. Hanyu swallowed his own words at once. The god went on, her voice tight and nervous. "I didn't mean to go silent. I was just surprised. And honestly, I don't know. I don't think Felix is much in the habit of doling out punishments." "Oh." Hanyu didn't know whether that was good news or not, but there wasn't much he could do about it either way. He opened one eye experimentally. Kenta and Lord Theodora didn't look angry or scandalized. If anything, they were watching him with concern. Gyuri was glowering down at her knees where they were drawn against her chest, and Chihiro— Who's getting punished? The old man asked. Hanyu wasn't sure whether the quiver in his voice was age or fear. Lord Theodora launched herself across the little room to kneel at his bedside and clasp his hand. No one, dear, she soothed. Everything's all right. Chihiro's voice climbed in pitch and volume. Where's Ayumu? It wasn't us! We wouldn't... Hiro, you know I would never punish you or Ayumu, and I wouldn't let anyone else do it either. You're safe. How did Lord Theodora keep her voice like that? Calm and friendly and unruffled, as if the old man weren't thrashing and panicking. Ayumu! Chihiro called, and a foul smell reached Hanyu's nose. What had... Kenta? Lord Theodora jerked her head in Hanyu's direction, keeping all her own attention on Chihiro. Would you and Hanyu kindly fetch Ayumu? You too, Gyuri. The woman spat something at Lord Theodora and Zergish, but she followed Kenta and Hanyu out of the room. Instead of going in search of Ayumu, Kenta led them to his own room. Hanyu was surprised that none of Lord Theodora's other offerings had poked their heads out to see the commotion, though they could still hear Chihiro's cries as Kenta's curtain swished shut behind them. Kenta caught Hanyu's inquisitive look and explained. Ayumu was his husband. He's been gone for several years now. Hanyu had suspected it was something like that, but he still felt a pang gripping his chest and tears starting in his eyes. It was so sad to think of Chihiro endlessly waiting for a lover who was never coming back. Or, not a lover, but... Husband? Hanyu repeated dumbly. Kenta nodded, wide-eyed. Gyuri gave an exasperated huff and flopped down on Kenta's bed, pointedly ignoring their conversation. But the oath! The offerings and training had only had to give it once a year, but Hanyu still remembered the promises. In between oaths of obedience and devotion, they forswore all familial relationships, past, not too difficult, since they were all purchased by or gifted to the temple as infants, and future. No spouses, no children, no ties to distract from their service. Lord Theodora said that was stupid and married them herself, Kenta said in a half-whisper. He told me all about it, back when he remembered more. He said it was one of his happiest days. Some of the gods even came to the wedding and brought them gifts and blessings. Another piercing cry shattered Hanyu's thoughts of Chihiro as a blushing, glowing groom. He dropped his eyes guiltily. I'm sorry, he told Kenta's floor. I didn't mean to upset him. His friend sat cross-legged on the floor and sighed. It's not your fault. No one can guess what'll set him off. When Hanyu sank down beside him, Kenta darted a curious glance in his direction. Hanyu guessed what was coming and braced himself. Why did you want to know about Lord Felix's punishments? Kenta asked, sure enough. I was so stupid today, Hanyu whispered, and then he was crying as if he hadn't sobbed himself out in Antony's arms just a few hours before. By the time he'd spilled the whole story, Chihiro's cries had faded into silence and Gyuri was asleep on Kenta's bed. Kenta, bless him, hadn't said a word against Hanyu during the entire retelling. He just listened and gasped at the right places, his round face going pale and his hands lifting to his mouth. When Hanyu recounted Lord Thaddeus's rescue, Kenta slumped in relief. That must have been awful, he cried. Hanyu waved his hands in frustration. I don't know why it was so bad. I wish I could explain it better. A strange god coming up to you when you're alone is plenty, Kenta said firmly, and Hanyu could have melted into the floor with gratitude. They were interrupted by Lord Theodora's voice at the door. Strange as it might have been to say of an ageless god, she sounded terribly old and tired. Kenta, I'm sorry to bother you, but would you please sit with him while I take care of these sheets? He's sleeping. Of course! Kenta scrambled up and out the curtain, Hanyu staying on his friend's heels. Lord Theodora was standing with her arms full of sheets and blankets. She had them balled so that no stains were visible, but the stench of excrement was thick in the air. Sorry, she said to Hanyu, tipping her chin at her burden. I'll get these right out. But quickly, has Antony been punishing you harshly? No, he hasn't. Hanyu was so surprised by the question and her current occupation that he forgot to add an honorific. Barely at all. He's been so kind. And I still disobeyed him. Lord Theodora nodded. If he's rough with you, please tell me. I'll help you. With that earth-shattering statement, the god was off down the hallway with her stinking load. Hanyu should have been struck dumb by his surprise, but instead he found himself babbling as he followed Kenta back to Chihiro's room. Do you think she means it? Why would she just take my word for it? And even if she did, why would she interfere with my master? What does... Kenta hushed him as they returned to the old man's bedside. Chihiro was indeed sleeping, his mouth open in a way that made his whole face look impossibly slack and soft, and taking in loud breaths that clicked and whistled strangely. Hanyu forced his mouth shut. Clearly, Chihiro needed his sleep, but his mind was still whirling with questions, one more prominent than the others. What is Lord Felix telling Antony to do to me?